Hello and welcome to today's PINA Wisdom Story, where we get to listen in on the wisdom that can only be earned by professional permaculturists with 20 plus years of experience working within the permaculture framework. PINA Wisdom Stories gives us all a chance to hear from PINA diplomates, board members, and other pioneers from the early days of permaculture's development. We seek to make the connection between the elders in our field of study and permaculture enthusiasts everywhere on Earth. I'm Jesse, and I'll be hosting today's conversation, which should last about 90 minutes. Please leave comments in the live chat for today's guests, and I can make sure that Jason gets them, and that always makes the conversation flow better and more interesting when people are jumping in. And today we are honored to be able to feature Jason Gerhardt. For 20 years, Jason Gerhardt has professionally practiced and taught permaculture design in diverse environments, from the hyper-arid U.S. Southwest to underserved neighborhoods in North St. Louis to a refugee community in Central America. Jason's design portfolio includes academic campus planning, regenerative agriculture site development, organizational strategizing, food justice initiatives, farmer accelerator program development, and extensive work with conservation organizations. Jason has taught thousands of students for Naropa University, University of Colorado, the U.S. EPA, and Oregon State University, among dozens of private and public institutions. A developer of multiple land-based enterprises for ecological community development, he holds a BA in sustainable design from Prescott College, as well as permaculture diplomas in the fields of site design, education, and research from both the Permaculture Institute, Inc. and Permaculture Institute of North America. Jason, welcome.
Thanks for having me so much, Jesse.
Oh, it's absolutely our pleasure. Where are you coming at us from today?
I am in a little village on the Delaware River called Upper Black Eddy. It's in Pennsylvania on the New Jersey border.
Okay. And have you lived there long, or is that a new place for you?
Relatively new, not quite here 2 years. We left St. Louis, which was where we were previously, for here. And now, actually, in a year or two, we'll be heading up to New York.
Okay. Like city or more like upstate?
Upstate, yep.
Okay. Awesome.
Definitely
Cool.
not the city.
You're definitely not the city.
Definitely
No
not
offense,
the city.
city livers.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Well, I'm a city kid, but maybe we'll get into that actually.
Well, in fact, let's go back there, because I always like to hear a little bit about like how you got into permaculture and like backstory, in even so far back as like where you were born and raised, or maybe that's not the most important thing, but it's like what places sort of like were meaningful to you in your development, and then how did you find permaculture? Maybe you can take us there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love telling this story. So I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a product of St. Louis. as a city kid, and I I was in a lot of trouble as a kid. St. Louis
Mm,
is a rough city. There's a lot going on there that, historically has led to high poverty, high violence rates, major crime rate. It's just one of the more, struggling cities with crime and that kind of thing in the U.S., sort of on par with Detroit,
yeah.
or historically at least.
Which, by the way, I'm in Michigan, not too far from Detroit, so that's a familiar connection there.
Yep. Yeah. Very similar cities, like, had a lot of industry. The industry collapsed and employment left and racial discrimination, all of that is just coming together to create what St. Louis is now. As a kid,
Hey, Jason, let me interrupt you real quick. I think your mic on your headphones is just scratching against your hoodie, maybe just a bit.
yeah, yeah, is that better?
I think so. It was
Okay.
when you were moving, and
Okay.
it's not a big deal, but I'd hate for it to be throughout the whole recording.
No, I hear you. I think I'm holding it away from my clothes now.
Okay, sorry.
No
Keep
worries.
going.
Here's our tech world. This is what we got.
That's right.
So yeah, St. Louis was, it was a rough place in the early '90s in particular, when I was growing up, and I ran with some tough crews. I got in a lot of trouble. I had friends who were murdered at young ages. I've
Mm,
had other friends who killed other people and are now in jail for their lives, or most of their lives, and that had a huge impact on me as a kid. My first friend was killed when I was 13. And
wow.
so I was angry, I was pissed off, I didn't like the world, I didn't like what I saw. I sort of thought it was the city that I was raised in, like, that's what the world was. And after enough trouble, I just sort of woke up a little bit and was like, "I'm gonna die or I'm gonna go to jail. What do I want for my life?"
Mm,
That was really, like, 18, and I got into Zen Buddhism.
mm,
I was basically seeking, like, personal salvation or redemption, those kinds of things at that age. Is just like, I need something to get me into shape and guide me in life because my culture wasn't able to do it. And so I dove really deep into Zen Buddhism. I almost became a monk. 2 weeks before my ordination, I decided not to, that I wanted to be engaged in the world
wow.
and not sort of tuck away in a monastery and just sort of work on me and myself and within a
Mm,
small community. So had no idea what I was going to do after that. I had heard of the word permaculture. The monastery I was at, we built a lot of gardens. There were fruit
mm,
trees everywhere. It was a Vietnamese monastery, and so their culture really shone through in their agricultural practices throughout the grounds. And so I decided permaculture might be an interesting thing, and lo and behold, here I am. 20 years later, that's basically my story of how I got into it. That's what
that's
led me into it.
yep.
And I was seeking, honestly, I think it's important to say I was seeking something that could help me make the world a better place.
Yeah.
At the time, that's sort of how I would have articulated that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. We're still having some of that sound issue. What if we take off the headphones entirely? Think that would work?
How's this?
That's okay. It's a little bit of a different sound, but I'm not hearing I
Was it
hate to be
sort of a was it like a clicking?
yeah, it's like a clicking kinda when you moved your head. It sounded like it was hitting a button or something, but
What about now? Is that better?
so far,
Okay.
move
It
your
might
head a
have
little
just
bit.
Yeah, it might have just been the connection.
I think that's better. I think we got it.
Okay,
So
great.
let's go back though, man. That's such a fascinating story. I so resonate with the being pissed off and just sort of like I don't know if hating the world is the right attitude, but it was something like that. It was something like, "What is this place, and why is everything so messed up?" And your experience seems even more concentrated than mine. Mine was more the suburban angst version of that, um,
Mhm.
and the clear vision that I had as a kid and a youth that like the world was kind of going to hell in a handbasket. It's like, man, we're going in all the wrong ways. Where's the wisdom? Where's the adults in the room? Where's the, sensibility to any of this? And I also found Buddhism through Alan Watts, and then later maybe Thich Nhat Hanh is woven into your story too with the Vietnamese Buddhism.
Absolutely. He was Thich Nhat Hanh was my teacher.
Okay.
Yep.
That's amazing. What an amazing teacher. And that really also shaped my life completely and gave me a much like a breath of fresh air and a new take on who
Mm.
I was and how I was to be in the world. And I also kind of had a similar, I didn't go as far as you in terms of like I want to be a monk, but I was like really, really into it. And at some point, I also wanted to come out a little bit more into the world and engage more actively into the world. And that's right around when I think I first heard about Bill Mollison through Joel Salatin, maybe.
Hmm.
And when I finally found Bill Mollison, it really changed my life completely. A lot of his writings and teachings just activated me and moved me into the world at large. So tell me a little bit about some of your first like permacultural escapades. Did you go on to just like read a bunch on your own, or did you take a PDC right away? Did you just start like playing in your own garden?
I actually initially ended up in a um, ecological design course, and
Okay.
I would say like my tradition sort of in permaculture work broadly isn't just permaculture because I do draw a lot from ecological design. So I ended up there very quickly, ended up in a PDC.
Okay.
This was at Prescott College. Andrew Millison at the time actually taught at Prescott College. This was like maybe his second course ever. And so
Mm.
he was my original teacher. We're good friends to this day. But that school had the course was interesting. It was a block, so it was a little over 3 weeks, and we basically got in a van and drove to Tucson, visited Brad Lancaster, eco villages, drove all over Arizona and the Southwest basically in a van, touring permaculture sites and meeting practitioners.
Fun.
Yeah,
Over what period of time? Was that over like a semester length?
it was a block, so it was like 25 days or something like that.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was your first real exposure to like seeing permaculture, meeting permaculturists and getting immersed into that world.
Yep, yep. And I was actually kind of critical of it at first. I
Mm.
sort of felt like it was overly materialistic, like it was missing the spiritual element that kind of drew me into permaculture was that spiritual element in the sense
Oh.
of I was coming from a spiritual background and perspective with Buddhism and having left the monastery. So
Mm.
I was sort of like critical of it, but I've stuck with and almost been critical of it for a long time. But I just stick with it because it still has so much value, you know,
Yeah.
and I've found ways to sort of make meaning of it more spiritually significantly, I guess, than how I encountered permaculture.
I think your criticism of it being more materialistic is very valid to this day. Just given the culture that it came from and the thought forms and worldviews that informed it. But I agree with you. I feel the same. I've kept with it and always weave back into permaculture. Even if I go outside of the permaculture purview for my own interests, it
Hmm.
just comes back because it's so steeped in nature and natural pattern and the ethics, and it'll hold, I think. But I do wonder if the spiritual piece is sort of a linchpin that is missing within permaculture. And I know Bill Mollison and everybody who teaches PDCs, like, we can't teach the spiritual, we can't teach mysticism. And I
Hmm.
get that because that can be so misconstrued, and then you can get into guru things, and I understand that. But I do wonder, like, do you think there is first, do you think it's critical to weave back in the spiritual and the sacred into permaculture? And if so, how might we do that with still honoring the original intention and sort of the non-denominational aspects of permaculture?
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. Well, for one, I don't think it was Bill never really wanted it to be a part of permaculture. Uh, he was spirit phobic a little bit, as Scott Pittman would describe him, and there's a lot of people that are in permaculture and have been teaching, and they are very spiritual people and have woven in things like dances of universal peace and even just like singing and songs and holding hands in a circle. Like that's too much for some people.
Right.
And I get all that. It's not important. It's not about imposing a spirituality, but I like what you said about the sacred. I certainly think the sacred needs to be brought into permaculture, and I think it is for most people who have been practicing it a long time. I find a lot of them actually end up getting more spiritual over time,
Mm,
and so that was certainly true for Scott Pittman. It's it's a pattern, and I think that's useful to track. Like, I love these wisdom stories because it's sort of tracking the stories of elders that, like, what has a long journey been through permaculture looked like.
yeah.
And a lot of them end up with a little more of a spiritual bent, at least. I think in terms of weaving it into the curriculum or anything, I don't know. I don't really have any specific thoughts there, like the PDC curriculum, but I think we say that permaculture has its roots in indigenous cultures and practices and traditional ecological knowledge, and we've certainly borrowed a lot of different techniques and technologies and even ways of thinking from indigenous and traditional people all over the world. And I don't think we can actually keep saying that if we're not also honoring the sacred, because
Right.
those practices and traditions did not get developed in a vacuum, like in a material vacuum. It was deeply informed by a connection with spirit and the sacredness of all life.
Yep.
So how do we reclaim that? I don't know. How do we not reclaim that? How do we bring that in perspective into permaculture? I don't know specifically um, how that looks, but we are actually working on it through the Permaculture Institute. We're developing a course called the Permaculture Paradigm,
Mm,
and really sort of trying to focus on the mindset shift that happens in practicing permaculture and tying that a little bit into a experience of sacredness and interconnectedness, of everything. Like, that is the paradigm shift. We're actually shifting to see the world in a more interconnected way.
yeah. Yep, exactly. And Bill might have said that he's spirit phobic or whatnot, but just talking to Michael Skeeter Pilarski last week, he mentioned, Bill got along really, really well with indigenous people everywhere, it seems. And that that resonates with something about his depth of understanding of the sacredness of the tree and the river and the rock and the land, and that it's not just this material object for us to like take and leave and maneuver around it for our material gain, but it's like it has impacts. And I think the seventh generation thinking is something that we could weave into permaculture. And I know a lot of permaculturists, of course, talk about this and weave this in, but that's critical too, because that thinks not just about the sacredness of place and material objects, if we want to call them that, like the river, etc., but also the sacredness of time, and like what we do here unfolds over time for future generations, and we have to be sensitized to that and consider that in our designs. So
And that's
yeah,
really what
I'm
we're designing for, right? Is like, so there are future generations.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, abundance. So that's cool that the PI is doing that sort of work, and that's one of the things that I've loved about learning about the Permaculture Institute that you work with. And are you the director of, or what's your label there?
I'm co-director.
Okay,
Natalia Vega, who is Costa Rican, she is my co-director.
okay,
Yeah.
and we'll get more into PI and talk a little bit about more what you're doing. But I love that you're taking a lot of the roads less traveled that inform permaculture, and I think it seems to me like really good pattern recognition. Like, you're not doing it because you think it's cool, you're doing it because it's come up a lot with the
Hmm.
practitioners and the people that you worked with. So I love that you're doing that work.
That's well put, that it's just come up. It's emerged.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Those are the best things to contribute, in my experience, rather than just trying to force function. So let's go back a little bit and let me know when it's time to jump into slides. Like, if it makes more sense here, just say so, and we'll do that. Jason's put together a great little slide presentation of his work, so we can see some visuals. But let's talk about Scott Pittman a little bit. I unfortunately never met Scott. My teacher Larry Santoyo was really close with Scott and speaks
Hmm.
really highly of him to this day, of course. But I never got to work with him. So tell me a little bit about your interactions with him, how you first met him, and Scott's role in creating the Permaculture Institute. However you want to weave that story, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. I met Scott in 2005. Andrew Mollison actually introduced me and to him in a advanced design course. And Andy kind of like pulled me aside and was like, you should, you should like try to study with Scott. And as I learned more about Scott and what he had done, that he had been practicing for so long, for one, that he had studied with Bill, or studied and taught with Bill Mollison for years, I was like, hey, let me just go to the source of this thing and see what I can do. And Scott was pretty receptive. I didn't really connect with Scott fully until I think it was 2011 in a teacher training with him and Larry Santoyo.
Mm.
And that's when I first met Larry. We're still good friends to this day. And Scott basically invited me to teach with him. He was like, you've got something I want to teach with you. I was like, that's amazing. Great. So he put me under his wing in a lot of ways. I had, I'd be remiss to not mention one of my first permaculture mentors in Sandy Cruz, who's passed now. She really gave me a lot of opportunity early on. I took a teacher training with her and Becky Elder also.
Mm.
And Sandy and I taught together for several years in Colorado in various places. But Scott sort of came after Sandy in some ways, and for me as a mentor, and he needed help at that point. He was getting older. He'd traveled the world, taught permaculture on every continent except for Antarctica.
Wow.
And he needed somebody to kind of like support him at times and teach for him when he was tired. And so it just started out slow like that. And eventually we ended up doing courses, several courses together in the US and Costa Rica and a few other places.
Where was he living at the time, and where were you guys you living at the time?
I was in Boulder, Colorado. He was just outside Santa Fe.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just say too that I was fortunate to work with Sandy Cruz. I took a teacher training in Ann Arbor with her and Peter Bain in 2014, I think. And that was my one and only interaction with her. But I'm glad that you had that connection as well. She's an amazing teacher and really contributed a lot to the field of permaculture.
Yeah.
And so you'd already been teaching, it sounds like, portions of PDCs and various things on your own and with Sandy and in the Colorado world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I ended up teaching. I taught in Arizona and New Mexico too, just sort of popping around in courses.
Yep. And I think that there's something like really critical that he invited you into, like you didn't force your way in. It was an invitation. And I think that's a critical piece to the permaculture teaching lineage, is that as we get to be a little bit on the elder side, and we've been teaching for years and years now, that we start to invite people who seem really keen on it and have something to contribute in, to give them the opportunity to sort of like step into that role as time passes. So that's awesome that he did that. And that's awesome that you were there to receive that and pick up that mantle.
That's almost how permaculture has been for me in general. Like I learned it in college, or I formally learned it in college. And after college, I just started farming and I ran a seed company working with some masterful growers, and never really thought of like permaculture as a career. And it just sort of emerged where people said, you seem to know a lot about, would you do a consultation with my yard? Never even dawned on me, frankly, to go around to people's yards and charge them for consultations, and that they would find that valuable.
Right.
So it's always been an invitation, to sort of people asking. And I think that is a good mark of the world sort of letting you know what it needs from you in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about your early, on that sort of thread, like how did you make money with permaculture? How did it become part of your career in terms of like livelihood? And then we'll get into the slideshow where we can really see what you've been up to more professionally. But how did those first, like, it sounds like it just started with, hey, you want to consult on my yard? And then where did it go? Did you start a design firm? Were you more on the gardening or farming side or other?
I basically started like a permaculture inspired landscape design company.
Okay.
As I realized that there was a market for that, I was in a fairly progressive area where people would want native plants and rain gardens and food forests and, you know, all that, the sort of landscape strategies of permaculture. And it was slow. I mean, and I wouldn't say, permaculture is not the best way to make money. So it's never been about that. But I made enough. Like it was enough for me between teaching and designing and consulting. And I also really lived simply. And that's, I think, another hallmark of people who are in permaculture for a long time. They're actually like living a voluntary simplicity on some level. The principles and the ethics will probably have you there anyway,
Yeah.
if you're applying them. And I've lived really simple. And so I've lived very simple and I've been able to do what I love, actually. I think that's important. Um, it,
Yeah.
it's not the best paying work in the world. But I am at a point, 20 years later that I can charge a really good amount for a design because I feel so confident that
Yeah.
the value is there for a farm project or a campus or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. As your skills level up, then you can get those higher prices. But it's ironic kind of in a way because it's like you've gotten so good at living more simply that it's like the money's just this bonus. It's not like, wow, now I'm going to move to a bigger house or something. It's just like, oh, okay. Doesn't really change much of how I'm living anyway, but it's nice.
Exactly. Larry says that a lot, about, Armageddon and just sort of doom and gloom. He's just like, I wouldn't change anything I'm doing, so I'm just
Yeah.
living my life.
Yep.
And that's how I feel with income. And there's lean years and there's bonus years,
Yep.
it ebbs and flows like any cycle.
Yeah, and permaculture for me has been it's kind of weird to think of it this way, but it has been so focused in my life, in my permaculture expressions through income streams and like
Mm,
resiliency in my income streams, which is funny because I've been very anti-capitalist for part of my angst as the suburban youth ties into that like what is this economic model that just drives this ecological destruction and psychopaths taking power and all that. And so I've been very like resistant to money in a way, which I don't
mm,
think is necessarily the best attitude. I think I've changed that in the past 5 years or so. Um, but it has allowed me, permaculture has really got me to think creatively about how I have resiliency in my income stream. So I've always had multiple jobs and have flowed where, if something withers a bit, I can flow into something else to sort of take up the lack in that income requirement. So I've used permaculture a lot in that way. And I am kind of curious about I think Bill Mollison wrote a PDF or something at some point. Maybe you read it, like Permaculture Millionaires or something. Did you ever read that one?
I did read that. I can't recall what was in it exactly.
Yeah, I don't really either, but it was sort of like saying like you can use permaculture design to like really make a lot of wealth, and then with the ethics would tell you then redistribute that wealth into the systems that created it, thereby growing permaculture maybe a little bit faster.
Hmm.
I was enticed by that idea, but I've never become the millionaire. So
Few have. I don't think there's a lot of those.
exactly, few
Scott would
have.
describe Bill would, he'd go and teach in the West and the North and fill up his pockets in money, and then he'd go teach in the South and empty his pockets of money. And so that
Yeah.
was like always his ethos. I think that sort of anti-capitalist angst is maybe baked into permaculture. Maybe not so politically as like real anti-capitalists, but um, yeah, it's we all. I don't think anybody gets into permaculture because they want to make a bunch of money, and if they
Right.
do, they're probably not in the right place.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do have a bunch of money and you're into permaculture, try to bring those energy forms in terms of money back into the systems that you want to see grow. With money, you can really take projects to another level in terms of time, like speeding up time for implementation and whatnot. And you can really help benefit ecosystems everywhere with a little bit of extra money. So consider that if you're listening and you've got deep pockets. Tell me, have you met Bill Mollison? Did you get a chance to meet him or work with him at all? No.
I never met Bill. Nope.
Okay.
I've been surrounded by people who worked closely with Bill, like Scott and Larry, Delvin Sulkinson, Joel Glansberg. Bill spent a lot of time in the Southwest initially in North America, and so that's where I learned permaculture. And there's just a ton of Bill students there.
Yeah, that's what I gather. And wasn't there? What was the magazine that we were talking about at some other conversation that came out?
The Permaculture Drylands Journal.
Yes. Okay. I know that wasn't your endeavor, but you know some of that history. Can you tell us a little bit about how that got started and where it's gone since?
Yeah, a bunch of students of Bill in New Mexico started the Permaculture Drylands Institute, and they started a journal as sort of their newsletter for the institute, and that grew into a magazine. I now have the complete collection, and we're about to digitize it to sort of reshare that with the world. There's a lot of great wisdom in it that, frankly, it feels like we've sort of lost in permaculture. So we're excited to kind of bring that back. That institute is what grew into PI. The Drylands group kind of got a little tired, and Scott and Bill picked that up basically and started that as Permaculture Institute.
Okay, that's great. Hey, please come back and let us know when you get those digitized to share, because that's a great resource that I think we'd want to know about and help promote or help sort of like draw people to.
Absolutely.
Well, great. I think now would be a great time, if you're in agreement, Jason, to hop onto slides so we can kind of see the work that you've been involved in a more visual sense.
Awesome. Let me get this all set up.
Yeah. Let's see. I got this. Oh, I was going to say, now it's not working, huh?
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can. Yep, that looks good.
Cool. Yeah, I put this together. I did want to sort of share my.
Oh, wait, you'll have to pull up the presentation because I'm seeing like the EV Mux room currently.
Okay, then I might be on the wrong screen share thing. Let me undo this.
Yeah, and no worries. Everybody here is used to, we got some technical stuff, but that's the way of the world.
Now I can't do it by entire screen as we did in our little test.
Really? Can you do the other one then?
I can do window, but I don't think it's not going to show my presentation. It only shows the.
Oh, and you can't do tab. Well, tab would be the same thing. So let's see here. What is that presentation on? Is that like a PDF?
It's a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Maybe I can load it into like Google Drive real quick.
Yeah, or email it to yourself maybe. That's annoying. I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know why.
It's technology. I mean, it doesn't work really.
We pretend like it works, but
totally. This stuff is just it's not real.
Well, if you're out there in the chat, I see a few people got their eyes on us. Say hi, or if you have any questions for Jason, now would be a good time with a little bit of a technological lull here while we figure out this next step. Where are you from and what you thinking about? I wonder what would change that. Let's see, entire screen.
Oh, now I get the entire screen option. Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay. Hey, there we go.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, sorry about that. Looks good, though, on my end. Here, let me transfer it over. Okay, everybody can see that now, so we're good to go.
Great.
Thanks, Oliver, for chiming in. He's like, hi, I'm from Boulder. So another fellow Coloradan, or at least some Colorado connections. Thanks, Oliver.
Yeah, so I put together this little show. One, I just wanted to show some of my work. I also want to narrate a story and sort of insight that I feel like is important for has been important for my permaculture practice. And feel free, Jesse, to ask questions at any point in this too.
Okay, thank you.
But I want to start with a project, a really tiny project, actually, that had a sort of outsized impact on my practice of permaculture. And it was, I had a couple in a PDC, and they asked me to come over to their suburban home and give them a landscape consultation, basically.
Mm.
And it was a tiny, tiny little spit of land, and we're literally looking at it. And the property
Oh,
line's right
that is
here.
tiny.
So they only had half of this, not even half. They had
Oh
like the
my
worst
god.
half.
Okay.
There was some other parts of the yard that we did too, but this was really the more exciting part of it. And I walked around with them. We talked about some options. I wasn't really feeling it, honestly. Like my work was moving to bigger scales at this point.
Mm.
I wasn't doing as much residential, and so I wasn't feeling it. But by the end of it, I realized that I liked these people. I cared about them. Um, I wanted them to have a beautiful space to interact with nature. You know, they didn't have that. They had like gravel and really bad grass. So I decided to do it. I hired a couple students from the university I was teaching permaculture at the time. We got their daughter involved. So we dug
Oh,
some swales. Oh, the other key piece is I said I'll only do this if you get your neighbor to do it too, so that
nice.
we can use this whole space. So they went to the neighbor and said, "We want to get this area landscaped. We'll pay for it. Can we do it?" Of course, the neighbor was like, "You'll pay for it. Do whatever you want."
Sold.
And so we got even more. Really, what it was we got their roof water because their downspout was right here,
Right.
and we could send their downspout this way and the homeowner's downspout the other way, and irrigate this whole thing and take it off of city water, that was a goal of mine at the time.
Yeah.
So we dug it out, planted, basically like food forest, right? Kind of classic food forest style plants, trees, fruit trees and shrubs, and herbaceous plants and pollinator plants. And a year later, it sort of comes to
Whoa,
life.
that looks great.
It's not the most right. This isn't like a pollinator refuge, this isn't having a huge impact on ecosystem services. It's not like this isn't performing miracles. But what I realized was it was performing miracles in the lives of the people who lived with it. And
Mm.
John here in the background was one of my clients. He he was a voiceover artist. He basically worked in a soundproof vault in his basement, doing recordings all day. And his
Mm.
health was deteriorated. He had, what I would call nature deficit disorder. He needed something to bring life back to him, and this garden became that. He was going to be the weeder. He decided he found that very meditative. Got him outside, breathing fresh air, interacting with the soil. All that stuff actually started to have a profound impact on him.
Yeah.
I saw how it impacted their daughter. She's building fairy houses and little habitat homes and
Mm.
catching toads, and like they had a wild space to interact with, to sort of help rewild themselves, in their little suburban cul-de-sac. And so it became important for that reason to me. And eventually they invited me over and said, "We have something we want to talk to you about." And I was like, "Okay." And they told me they were moving. They're like, "We know you love this garden and you put a lot of energy into this, and we just felt like we deserved to tell you face to face that we're moving." And I was like,
Wow.
"Oh, I don't care." Um, and it was natural for me to say that because I had realized through that project that it wasn't about the garden, it was about them
Oh.
and them carrying that forward. And that's how culture changes, right? Is that people change and then they influence other people, and it gradually grows from there.
Mm.
And so that's sort of a theme in this show, in the sense that I really think permaculture is about people.
Yeah.
The planet's fine, relatively speaking. It's really people that are causing a lot of the problems. And so we got to work on ourselves. And I think that's actually what permaculture does and is for. And I've seen it in several projects. And this is another one. About a year later from that previous project, a professor from Utah State University, a sustainability professor, called me up and said, "Hey, we're doing a landscape redesign for campus, and we really want it to be as ecological as possible and exemplify some permaculture principles and this kind of thing. And would you be able to help us with this?" I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll come out." So came out and looked at the space, saw a ton of opportunity. This is just one of the spaces. We basically ripped up parking lot and put in a little bit of
Oh, wow.
paradise.
Yeah.
Um, we did the whole campus. I'm just going to show a little section of it, but we took water off the roofs. Basically, we figured, how are we going to irrigate this in a climate that gets 9 inches of rain a year, 9 inches of precipitation a year, including snow? And the obvious solution there is gather water off of surfaces like rooftops and parking lots. And so we took all the water we could off of roofs and surfaces, put it into the soil, designed swales, and diverted the water ever so slowly. These are not on contour, and so that the water moves and stretches along this whole
Mm.
strip all the way down here, and it goes even further. It's like 200 feet. Um, there's water flowing through it after it's been sheet mulched and trees planted. This is 7 years later,
Wow.
and this is 10 years later.
Wow. Excellent.
So a real success. It doesn't get city water. It's just totally off rainfall, and
Mm.
passive, and filled with peaches and cherries and apples and figs and grapes and currants and all kinds of stuff. And there's a community of people that love this garden, love this campus. They actually, it's not the Moab University, Utah State University campus anymore. They built a new campus. Now it's sort of like a nonprofit hub. So a lot of different community service organizations have offices there, and it's sort of like a nonprofit co-working space of sorts.
Mm.
But there's a whole community of people that love this, to where when it did change hands, a huge stipulation was, we're not going to sell this property to anybody who isn't going to maintain these gardens.
Wow.
And so that was sort of baked into the tradition of this campus, or this set of buildings and landscape.
Yeah.
And how another reason that this was another project that made me realize permaculture is about people, because how
Mm.
we did this was, Roz McCann, who was the professor at the time, she and I co-created this workshop series to invite students and staff and faculty to participate in the design of the landscape. And so 40 people showed up and got to be involved in the design of it. We did another one when we implemented it. So we did 2 days back to back of digging all the earthworks, planting trees and shrubs, mulching, doing soil prep, and all that stuff. All of that happened with this core community of people. And I was like a mad person running from station to station. I mean, we had the islands in the parking lot that were harvesting water that people were working on. We had several sections of this campus. So I just had to run from section to section. And my overall impression of that day was everybody's smiling.
Mm.
And I realized that that's an important function in human society, when you gather people together joyfully. And as this project grew and grew, and I just kept getting stories from people, I realized that people love this landscape because they
Yeah.
were a part of it. And they go back to get peaches and harvest cherries and harvest apples and bring them to the food bank, or whatever. Like, people love this space, and that's why it still exists.
Yeah.
And not all of my designs still exist, right? If you're working in an urban, suburban context, things change so much, you know. I've had several designs go under the bulldozer just because we need to put a new building here now, you know,
Yeah.
that sort of urban development pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. This reminds me of the experience of people smiling reminds me of the word conviviality,
Mm,
which is sort of like talk about nature deficit disorder. I think we also have conviviality deficit disorder, where our forebears and our ancestors, kind of no matter how far back we want to trace them, they would work together, and whether that be harvesting or planting or tending to the landscape. But there's such joy when you're working with people on projects in the land or building, that really is like irreplaceable. You can't get it simulated through some type of digital interface or being on the
totally.
computer. It's a human to human thing, and it's all the better or all the more profound when it's human to human, with nature as the under sort of like the ground, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I also want to just highlight, did you do a Joni Mitchell reference earlier when you said that you took out a parking lot and put in a
Yeah,
paradise?
tongue in
I like
cheek
that.
there. Yep.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. I remember hearing that song as a kid and was like, "Oh, that's interesting."
Me too, and I also remember thinking as I learned about permaculture, oh, like, you can literally build on top of pavement and put in paradise, or you can tear it out and put in, like, a garden like you did, so that has always struck me.
Oh, no. What happened? I hit it.
Oh, I don't know. Don't ever hit the button, Jason.
I I hit the button. Here we are.
And I was just this weekend, we were working on a blueberry project for somebody, and it was a very convivial based experience. He had his family out for, um like, his birthday party, and there was kids, there was elders, and everybody was planting blueberries, and same exact feeling of like permaculture is people more than anything. The landscape,
Yep.
and we always say that, I think, in the permaculture world, more than the landscape stuff, it's about the community stuff, and the how to re-knit community back together is a major function, I think, of permaculture design.
Can you see this now?
I can see yours. Yep.
Oh, it went back to the beginning, didn't it?
Oh yeah, you hit play from start, but that's okay.
Here we are. As you can all see, I am a tech wizard. Um, I don't like this digital era. It's not for me. I've realized it's sort of a colonizing force in my life.
Yes,
Um,
like,
I so all along as I did these projects, I was teaching at Naropa University in a permaculture program for 6 years, and this program was actually handed to me by Marco Lamb, who's a PINA board member,
mm,
and he got it started and had this greenhouse built. It's like a 22-foot dome, geodesic dome, and can't college was in session from like September to April. In Colorado, it could snow any one of those months, and so a greenhouse became essential if you were going to teach permaculture. And I took this program over sort of as the greenhouse was just finished and a few plants had been put in, and I, I sort of designed this up with my students with figs and kumquats and pomegranates and citrus and all kinds of stuff, basically to just have a little space to interact with, so students could see a cultivated ecosystem in the winter and taste
mm,
unique fruits and smell unique plants and all that. The thing about this that I really want to hit home is I was with these students for it was the PDC stretched over 2 semesters. So in the spring, they would take the first half, in the fall, they'd complete it. And that meant I got to be with students for a full year, which is really different than like a 2-week PDC in terms of contact hours, both for students with the teacher, but also for the teacher with the students. And what I learned through that extended format was that permaculture really changed how people think. And
mm,
I watched my students' minds change. And not all of them wanted to be, doing landscape projects or farming or any of the kind of more quintessential things you see in permaculture, some of them just ended up embodying the principles so much as a clay artist or a fiber artist or as a outdoor educator, right? They ended up bringing permaculture into what they were interested in,
Mm.
which I thought was really profound and helped me see that permaculture is really about a culture changing phenomenon. And it's not necessarily about generating more consultants and landscape designers and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
If that's somebody's interest, by all means, but there's so many other aspects of permaculture that I started seeing my students actually remind me of, like that last chapter in Mollison's designer's manual basically says, and here's all the other things we need to do with this framework,
Yeah.
like economics and business and legal systems and all of it, right? So
Yeah.
I started realizing that if everybody was trained to be a permaculture landscape consultant, then we'd never get to that other stuff. And so I better start talking about permaculture as a culture changing phenomenon,
Hmm.
not as regenerative land management,
Which is
and
an aspect of it. Yeah.
exactly. And so even though that was my passion in it, like actually that really brought me a lot of joy and solace and purpose. I just didn't need to impose that on everybody else. And there's so much more to permaculture that we have to do to really fulfill its promise, So
Yeah, that reminds me that echoes with Larry Santoyo's sort of like decree that always just stuck with me since he first said it in my PDC with him, which was, you don't do permaculture, you use permaculture in what you do.
that's
And
exactly
so
right.
the story that you just told is a great example of that. I use permaculture in my clay, I use permaculture in my teaching, I use permaculture in my legal career, you know. That's the more that's the cultural aspect that you were saying, and I too relate to the landscape piece and the regenerative land management. That really struck a fire within me that was missing and will be with me until the day I die. But that's not for everybody, and it is really about true diversity means true cultural change with all
Yep.
the facets.
Yep. Exactly. And we need to work on all of it, right? It's not landscapes that are causing the problem.
Right.
Right. So um yeah, we have to change ourselves, or deprogram or yeah. Um I like to get my students outside too, in a context
Sorry,
of
I just read that title.
yeah, a little tongue in cheek there.
That's funny.
I like to give people skills, You may never do plumbing again, but at least you did it once. And I remember when I've done things once, I remember them and I'm like, oh, I have some familiar. I'm not shy about it at least.
Yeah.
And so I'm familiar with electric and plumbing and grafting and, tree pruning and like you name it, a whole bunch of stuff. I just want to just extend those skills and those experiences to my students too.
Yeah.
And it just became about them more than the landscapes we were building. Yeah, at the time it was cool to take this landscape around this geodesic dome and harvest water and gray water and plant it and eat from it and all of that. But it was really just like a laboratory. It was like a practice center as my students worked on developing an ecological form of consciousness kind of thing.
Mm,
That's sort of how I looked at it anyway. I
yeah.
know a lot of them did too. It was Naropa University after all, so
Yes.
um, which is a very unique, more kind of liberal artsy, Buddhist inspired university.
Yeah.
Kind of came out of the '60s and '70s era. As so, I did a lot of work in Colorado and the Southwest, and in fairly affluent settings and with fairly affluent clients. I started to become uncomfortable a little bit because I realized I wasn't that authentic to where I had come from in my permaculture practice. And so I sort of chalked up those years as like great spaces for learning and eventually built this drive to go back to St. Louis and and leave Colorado, leave the university job that I had, and transition that program to somebody else. And really I wanted to test permaculture. I wanted to really put it to the test in a tough place that I knew, to see what it could do, how it would be received, and um, just sort of see what was possible. And so when I moved to St. Louis, I found this neighborhood, Old North St. Louis, that had a very long-term, decades-old bottom-up restoration group that was comprised of neighbors who really just wanted to make their neighborhood better. And all of North St. Louis has really suffered from racial discrimination, a ton of resultant disinvestment and abandonment, and redlining, was a
Yep.
big part of it. All of that sort of came together to leave a neighborhood that's a lot of blocks look like this. They have, crumbling buildings, vacant lots in the places of formerly crumbling buildings. And here was this group of people not practicing like not using any labels, and they were doing community gardens, they were doing pollinator habitat and rain gardens, they were fixing up historic buildings, they were getting grants to do that work, they were taking it upon themselves to slow down traffic in the neighborhood, to create art in the neighborhood, to engage kids in the schools in the neighborhood in outdoor activity.
Mm.
And I just thought that was awesome. I was like, they might as well be practicing permaculture. Um, so I linked up with this neighbor. I moved into this neighborhood and immediately decided to go to this garden that I eventually ended up designing and building out a little more.
Mm.
Um, they had a garden and farmers market that the neighbors had started, and I just showed up and said, need any help? And they're like, oh yeah, we could use some weeding. You want to do some weeding? Right? Like, first classic kind of first volunteer task, put them to
Yeah,
weeding.
it's like Karate Kid lessons.
It's the first bucket of cold water. Yeah. You just splash a cold water in the face. Let's see if they come back, kind of thing. Um, I kept coming back. Weeding wasn't going to phase me at all. Over time, they learned that I had a lot of skill and experience with this, and they're like, we kind of don't know what we're doing. Do you want to guide us? And I kind of saw that, they could use the help. And so I ended up kind of taking the lead in the garden for a couple years.
Mm.
It was a unique space that there were rental plots. There were like 22 rental plots around a biointensive market garden in the middle.
Hmm.
And the market garden in the middle was managed by volunteers for the pop-up market in the garden. And so we just put up a tent in the garden every Saturday for 6 months out of the year and
Hmm.
sell produce for super cheap in the neighborhood. There wasn't a grocery store in the neighborhood. All there were corner stores. And so it was basically like a food justice, fresh food access kind of deal. And I was like, hey, I'm all about that. Let me help get production up so we can distribute even more food. That was basically my my idea.
Yeah.
And we did that, and we ended up generating so much food. And because it was all volunteer based, we didn't really need a budget. We didn't need to make money. We also didn't want to give it away at the time. And so we just decided to model after the most successful businesses in North City, which happened to be, unfortunately, dollar stores. It's like General Dollar and Family Dollar, Dollar Tree. They're all over the neighborhoods, and people are familiar with that concept. And so we sort of dubbed ourselves the dollar store produce stand.
Cool.
So $1 a bunch, $1 a pound, come get food, super cheap. A bunch of carrots, a bunch of kale, a bunch of collard greens, $1. Can't really beat that. And
No.
if somebody didn't have money, we wouldn't turn them away either. So every cent we got back, we just reinvested back into the garden to buy seeds or plants or tools or replace materials that wear out, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And the beautiful thing was that it was, being that I was coming out of Boulder, Colorado, like a fairly affluent community, here were neighbors that just got together and worked together for free and didn't ask anything of it because they saw the yield in it. And that struck me as a really profound model. If people have extra time to invest, like reinvest that into your community. And this community was particularly awesome in their goals and a real challenge. This neighborhood is, there are, people that won't go to this neighborhood, literally
Yeah.
just won't go there,
Yeah.
because it can be desolate at times.
Right.
And to me, it taught me a lot. I felt like this community can teach me about community development and community building. And
Yeah.
for as much as I gave, I got way more in return, in terms of what I learned and in the relationships I built and the friendships I have. Um, it was a really beautiful, just kind of like reciprocal exchange where no money was exchanged,
Hmm.
and I love that, as that sort of angsty youth didn't like the economic system. I really like finding actual value in free non-monetary exchange.
Yep. Yeah. And just on that, like, a couple things come up for me. One is like the 8 forms of capital, like you're really flexing and growing various forms of capital. It's just that the financial capital piece was absent in this project mostly.
Yep.
And like you just said, it was even better for that. Like it was maybe a more rewarding process and community engagement than had the financial piece been there. And then also I
Absolutely,
want
actually.
uh,
Absolutely.
Absolutely, you would say, yeah. And then I also am just reflecting on how you entered this system here, because you could have came in with much more of like, gee, what are these people doing? Aren't they gathering water and doing all the permaculture stuff?
Mm.
But you didn't. You came in humbly and said, yeah, I'll weed. I just want to be a part of this cool project here in my neighborhood. So it was very place based. You didn't go out of your way. It was like, this is right here. And particularly I think that's really important. As two white guys, maybe we shouldn't be the ones pontificating upon it, but working in lesser served or underserved or redlined neighborhoods, people of color, BIPOC, you don't want to come in with being the holier than now, knowing better than other people with that attitude. That's just going to turn everybody off and reinforce the colonial experience that we're trying to get away from. And so the way that you ended up doing it was sort of like, humbly, you're going to start weeding. And then they started to recognize, oh, actually, Jason knows a lot. Like maybe we could like invite him now to help design this and help to turn it quote unquote more permaculture or make it more productive or whatever the case may be. So I just want people to hear that as like that's a really good model if you want to work in underserved communities and engage in wherever you're at in place, but you feel a little bit like, well, I don't know how to engage with, I'm a white guy or whatever, and I don't know a bunch of black folks or indigenous folks. The way you did it, I think, is the way in a humble way. And then you see where it goes and where it develops. And you never know what will result.
I love that you saw that, because I use that story to kind of say the same thing. It's, be careful how you show up. Don't come in with a plan,
Right.
frankly. If you come in with a plan, nobody likes, I can tell you for a fact. I mean, I've been a part of these neighborhoods and communities for a long time, and nobody likes that.
No.
So come in with an open heart and mind and open hands and be willing to do something that maybe you're not perfectly interested in, and build relationships and then see where it goes. That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Um, and you'll be well received too. That's the other thing is, yeah, I guess another thing is you don't also have to come in with a whole bunch of lingo and jargon and, a lot of the stuff that our social justice movements are focusing on is like words. It's just talking. Like nobody cares, nobody cares what words you use, frankly, unless you're outright offending people. Just show up as a human and be yourself, and don't try to like put on some uniform and act. And like people will recognize another person. You don't have to bend over backwards to be accepted. So there's that
Yeah.
too. And we see a lot of that, like more like activist folks that come in, kind of academic activists, and really have no idea how to engage in the community. And so it partly makes me wonder, like, well, what are we teaching, right? And so we need people who know how to be in community and show up like that.
Yeah.
It was easier for me, though, I will say, because I'm from St. Louis and I have a lot of connections. I have a
Yeah.
history with North St. Louis. I know people in North St. Louis.
Yep.
That's actually pretty important. I guess that's all I'll say about that.
Yep.
Um, that project, though, was important because there's a lot of stuff like that going on in St. Louis, and a lot of urban farming and gardening. And I ended up building relationships with other urban farmers and gardeners through that work, because we all had mutual respect for each other for what we were doing. And this opportunity emerged to start a bigger sort of collective farm through that work. I was hired as its founding director. It was really dreamed into being by Jabron Jones and myself, who were just two kids from the same city who wanted more for their city. And Jabron was one of those urban farmers and gardeners and really big picture thinker, friend of mine to this day, who we put our minds together and started this idea. Let's start a collective farm. This is looking at it in 2021.
Mm.
And let's invite a bunch of our friends together and see what we can do together. And we found a landowner. Jabron actually made the connection with the landowner who gave us access to the land, and gave us a bunch of funding. This is a fairly philanthropic individual
Mm.
who ended up funding a lot of this project, hired staff members, bought a bunch of tools, bought implemented infrastructure and barns off of a
Mm.
design that I did, and we started a bunch of programs. I was hired as the founding director. This was in 2019, and the pandemic hit like within 6 months.
Mm.
So we were also, in a way, right on time, because we had a design, we had equipment, we were already moving, and suddenly people needed food in our city. And so we ended up doing a ton of food relief through this organization. It's still happening today, and I'll talk about where that went and sort of how that went. But before that, our idea to have it be a collective of sorts, of inviting what we ended up calling member growers to have spaces and basically scale up from the vacant lots they were growing in North City. Tyran here, who started Heru Urban Farming, he was farming a vacant lot across the street from his house, and I was friends with him. Jabron was friends with him, and we were like, Tyran, come on out, grow your business. And he was like, hell yeah. And
Mm.
so he came out. Several other people came out. We had other folks who wanted to farm but had like the very bare minimum of experience in farming, basically not enough to get a job farming. And
Right.
my ethos is that people who want to farm need to learn to farm farming. And so aspiring farmers belong farming. Put them in the field and make them learn. And
Yeah.
so here's a couple guys who were in that situation, had bare minimum of experience, and they got trained up, and now they're full-fledged farmers. They know how to produce an onion crop, that looks like this. And
Yeah.
that's the way to learn, right? It's almost not even like take a bunch of courses. It's kind of just like go do it with somebody who knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
But that's the best way to learn. We also did PDCs at this farm. They got kind of stopped by the pandemic, unfortunately. But I had a great group that a few things emerged from, even though we didn't get to finish that course. Two of the participants featured here, Jake and Nick. I don't have great photos of them, so we're looking at their butts. But These were two young guys who had gotten interested in urban agriculture. They'd started a garden in the park behind their house. They were lifelong friends. They lived in the neighborhood where this farm was. And they showed up with a bunch of garlic bulbs. And they had found a feral garlic in a weedy lot somewhere and decided they were going to scale it back up and get it to bulk back up in size, because feral garlic just divides and the bulbs get really tiny. So they revived it and brought it back to life. And they came to me when they needed more space than they had in their garden. He's like, we need like 1/8 of an acre. I said, we got 1/8 of an acre. Come on in, be a member grower. And so they did. They planted that up. That generated enough for an acre. So they planted an acre last year. That generated enough for 2 acres this year. And now they have a seed garlic business that they grow seed garlic for seed companies around the country and for other farms, buying new garlic stock in.
Awesome.
And so I love the story because it's exactly what I thought was possible in St. Louis, that like young kids whose only future might have been on the corner, like myself, frankly, if I didn't have the fortune and privilege to be able to get out when I did, that I could go there and actually inspire some young guys to take up a horticultural tradition and start a business and be entrepreneurial about it. It turned out that that's a real phenomenon, and it can actually work. So Jake and Nick are those guys. They found free garlic even. The whole story is just amazing, from how they started to where they are now, being a full-fledged garlic seed company. So we gave a lot of access to land to folks like that. And there's several other folks that started either produce businesses or herbal medicine businesses or cut flowers, and everybody's sharing tools. And mind you, none of this would have been possible without
Like, and turning it into a crop. Oh, I lost you there, I think, Jason.
Oh,
I got you
where?
back though. So you might want to go back maybe 30 seconds. You were just finishing up with talking about how they developed that into a 2-acre garlic seed production business.
Yeah. So basically, those guys are like the model of young people learning horticulture and agriculture and starting a business, And
Yeah.
that's part of what this Confluence Farms Collective was about, was kind of like accelerate businesses that they already have a plan, they already are in motion. Let's give them space and mentorship to accelerate what they're doing so they can actually make it. So none of this would have been possible without the funder buying all the tools, giving us access to the land, giving us a budget, and staff members even to help get this all going. Another member of that PDC, Leah Burnett, she came up to me in that course. We walked in, there's a bunch of forest on this property, and we walked into the forest for some observation exercises in groups and alone. And at the end of it, Leah came up to me and was like, I never been in a forest before. And it hit me because I had the same realization, but I was so much younger. And here she was, fully adult and well into her life, and still had never been in a forest before. And she was so impacted by the forest experience. She said, maybe I could lead nature walks through the forest here for people in my community. I was like, you want to do that? Sure. Like, absolutely. Go for it. So she started a program called Normalizing Black Women in Nature. And that really got going in a strong way.
Secure.
Can you not hear me, Jesse?
Hey, what happens? Did I seem to disappear?
I heard you humming, and so I figured I must not be connected. Can you see me? That's annoying.
See, again, I don't know if you can hear me. I can. Okay, you keep going to black. I don't know why.
I don't know. Can you see me now?
I can see you now. It might be on my end. I've been having some internet issues here and
I
there.
did see yours go out. I couldn't see you for a while. Can you see the presentation? Oh man.
Oh, we could hear Jason. Okay. So Matt's let me know that we could still hear you. So maybe I'm just like fading out, which is perfect. I'd rather it be that way. So you can just keep rolling.
Okay, can you see my screen though?
I can current.
I keep doing the wrong thing. Again, I'm really tech savvy. I think I lost you again, Jesse. If the listeners can hear me, let's go with that. So Leah started this program. She was eventually hired as a community engagement manager for the whole project and did a lot of different programs, one of which that we thought up was to do free veggie pop-up markets in the garden or in neighborhoods throughout North City. Because we had funding, we could just give the food away. And it was the pandemic and people needed fresh food. And these are neighborhoods that don't have access to great quality fresh food. And so she popped up in her neighborhood, started small, just basically putting it out on Facebook, like, hey, I'll be at the corner of so-and-so and so-and-so from this time, got a bunch of free produce, come get some. And it's taken off to where it's just like a booming thing. And it's a great model if you have funding and people growing food that are getting funding from elsewhere to distribute that food for free. She's now expanded to a couple different neighborhoods. Another big part of where the food went was to the North Sarah Food Hub that Jabron Jones started from earlier. He had a commercial kitchen space that had big walk-in coolers, walk-in freezers, and grant money to hire chefs basically to prepare food and distribute that food as pre-prepared meals. And so he got contracts with hospitals, schools, public housing projects to deliver prepared meals to families and seniors during the pandemic who were on lockdown, basically. So all the food was getting made to go to those programs. I think at this point, like tens and tens, probably hundreds of thousands of prepared meals have been distributed through this project. And it just grows and grows to now there's other cities getting interested that we're talking to. So another program that was started that the funder of the project actually thought up was, let's not have a community supported agriculture. Let's flip that on its head and have an agriculture that supports community. Mm-hmm. Because we had the money, we could give free produce boxes away. And so we went into the neighborhoods and advertised, we're going to have 20 free produce boxes to 20 families. This pilot, the first year was in 2021, I think. And those families would have to come to the farm to pick it up. And that was intentional because we wanted people to come to the farm and see a very diverse collection of people working together and have that experience of what farming looks like with like a new generation of farmers, and doing it in a very permacultural, high intensive way with rain gardens and edible landscape everywhere. I mean, the place is beautiful. And what ended up happening was some of those folks ended up connecting with each other, and they happened to be all elderly women who were a part of the Great Migration, where they left their agriculture, they left their farms and agricultural roots in the South and migrated to cities in the North. And this was during Jim Crow era and agricultural policy that was pushing people off of small farms. And discrimination and all that. Basically, we're going to the North. And for these ladies, they had agricultural roots and they got reconnected to their roots through this project. And it touched them so deeply. By the end of the season, they wanted to give something back because they'd received this for free. And they decided to get together and make face masks for all the staff and farmers at Confluence. Confluence didn't have a logo or a website, like basically still doesn't. Very much just ground focused, not on social media. It's not about that. But they came up with this tagline that says the healing land.
Mm.
And I thought it was beautiful because they told us what we were doing. The community came and said, this is what you're doing. You're providing healing. You're reconnecting us to nature. You're reconnecting us with our roots. You're showing that Black people can farm in a suburban environment and generate livelihoods and mentor youth. And all of that was so beautiful. And they viewed all that work as healing. And I think that the best thing you can get from a community is that they tell you what you're doing for them. And
Yeah.
that sort of goes back to like, how do you enter a community? You don't enter with a plan and a vision and a mission even. You enter with open arms and you let the community tell you what they need. And this community has clearly told this farm what its purpose is.
Mm.
And I left this project in 2000. I left this project about 18 months ago, and moved away from St. Louis because my wife wanted to be near her family, especially after the pandemic when we didn't get to see them for like 3 years, or 2 years. We made the move. The project's going still strong. Jabron Jones is now the director. They're going through a major transition right now. A lot of the staff members, there's been like some real disharmony on the project. And so I don't want to sugarcoat this. Like, this could seem like the most amazing thing in the world. And some of the experiences are that I had there are truly some of the most memorable moments of my life. And it's not all rainbows and unicorns though. It's really hard work. And there's some difficulty in the group right now. And how they work through it is going to be the real testament. But what a huge thing I learned through this project is that it's we really have to work on ourselves. We really have to know how to connect with each other and how to be honest and how to be humble and how to not seek our own fame
Mm.
and work together. And that's because I believe this work is really all about connection and mutualism to each other and the land. I think the essence of permaculture is developing an ecological culture. And for a lot of us, we've been so divorced from the land, from traditions, from community values, core values as community members, dependent on each other and accountable to each other. I
Mm.
think there's a lot of work that will have to happen through permaculture projects or within permaculture projects, focusing on that, because it almost seems like every time you get a group together to do something long term, it doesn't last. It falls apart.
Yeah.
And that's because we don't know how to work together. We are of a cultural mindset of individuality, and be careful of things that send you more into your individuality. I would say embrace things that send you into community and loving arms with others.
Mm.
And and we need to work, being that permaculture is about people, we need to let it work on us so that we develop further, so that we can do things together that lasts.
Mm.
And otherwise, it's just a little blip on the radar. And frankly, for communities in need, they're tired of that. There's been so many efforts that come and go, that get started, fizzle out. Be the difference, like be the ones who can make it work. If you have funding and it's a secure funding, move to the next stage. That's securing your relationships with everybody so that you can continue the work. So how are you connecting? That's like my big sort of koan at the end of this, is that I want everybody to take home and think about, how are you connecting in your community, in your local community? permaculture, we can get lost on the screen, we can get lost in social media, we can get lost promoting our business.
Mm,
Ultimately, it's about developing communal structures that help us get free of the mainstream. It's not about carving out a niche within the mainstream. It's about pulling the mainstream out of the current onto the edge. So I want people in permaculture. This is like my challenge right now is how are you connecting? You know,
mm,
it's not all about your business. It's not all about your bottom line. It's not all about a triple bottom line even. Like do the first things that aren't profit first and then try to make some money. Like I just want to see more community action with permaculture. And I think it's there. I think that's actually what permaculture is. But the online presence of it, it just doesn't look like that. And so, like, I want to get off digital spaces, frankly, because it's skewing what I think permaculture is actually all about. It's not about a livelihood. It's about building structures that help us get free. And that starts with ourselves, right? So decolonize your consciousness, right, in your own life, and then you maybe can help somebody else do the same thing. That's sort of like, that's my message. So I don't know if we're still connected. I might be freewheeling here without Jesse. Jesse's gone. Um, Maybe I'll pop into the YouTube and see if I can.
hey, I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Great. Hey.
Hey, man. And that was such a great last sort of statement that you were making. I'm sad that I missed it, but I think the audience got it, which is the most important thing.
Great.
So thank you, Jason, for sharing that, and thank you so much for honing in on that people piece to the permaculture puzzle and really sort of reminding us all what it really is all about. And I think I've worked in mental health prior to, and in mixed in with my permaculture study, and that it does seem to be where the rubber meets the road is how we engage in conflict, how we engage in difference, and that's really what community is about. It's warm and fuzzy a lot of times because you feel connected and you do great projects, but there's the real thing of like people getting triggered by each other, or people having disagreements about worldview or the way you talk to somebody, or perceived or real injustices, or mismanaging the human relationship, and somehow we have to work through those in our culture, kind of like what you were saying, and you may have already touched on this and I just faded out of my technology here, but it seems like we live in a culture where we tend to run from that. We just say, well, I'll just cancel this person, or I'll quit this community garden and I'll go to the next one, or
Mhm.
whatever. And that's, you know, uh, echoing along what you're saying, I would just encourage people to work through those hard conversations, keep that open mind enough to really hear somebody where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with them. And then seek to incorporate what they've said into your understanding of the tapestry of the community. Again, even if you don't fully agree, take it into consideration because that's their experience. And this ties all the way back into the Buddhist sort of conversation and like what Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, which is compassion, being able to like really, really, truly imbibe in what somebody else's experience is, even if it's discoherent with your own. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's maybe the final piece, that and being able to be rooted in place. That's the other thing our culture is not great at, is like, I'm a transplant. I live in Ypsilanti, but I grew up in Lapeer, so I'm a Michigan guy, but I haven't maintain that rootedness to place where my grandparents also had that same root, and their grandparents before them. So I think those are the two big issues in our way of developing that ecological culture, is the
Mhm.
rootedness of place, and then the ability to like truly disagree with each other and then grow into that and grow deeper into our community.
I'm so glad you mentioned the rootedness in place, which is something I've not done well. Honestly, I've moved around a lot, and that's just been life circumstances or opportunities or um, desire to go back to where I'm from, and my wife's desire to be near her family, right? And so, a, a part of the part of that issues at Confluence are that I left that project relatively early, And I was a leader on it, and people really looked to me as that. And I got a call yesterday. Somebody just said, I wish you were still here. And
Yeah.
as if I was going to prevent all that from happening. Maybe so, maybe not. But I just think it's a failing a little bit on my end for having left. And I can own that. I can realize that that was a disruption on the project at a point that it didn't need a disruption.
Yeah.
And so, I can own that too. And I think that's really important. Try to figure out where you want to be. I think Mark Krawczyk actually said this in his interview with you. Like, try to figure out where you want to be relatively soon, so you can get started. And even if that's just so you can plant trees and harvest sooner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. We have a couple comments here. I don't know if you can see these, if they pop up for you, Jason, or not, but
I can see that one.
you can.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Raphael, for saying that. And I agree. And our friend Matt, who I work with with PINA. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that.
Hey, Matt. Matt's
Yeah,
been. I know
you
Matt.
guys
I've
know.
gotten to meet him. Yeah, I really like him.
Yeah,
We're gonna get out on some river adventures soon.
that sounds really enjoyable to me. Well, let's wind down here. But I think in a previous conversation, didn't we talk a little bit about Bill Mollison stories? Or was it Scott Pittman stories that you were like, hey, remind me, I have some interesting stories that I might share.
Yeah, I guess I don't have Bill Mollison stories because I didn't know Bill, but I knew Bill through Scott, I feel like. And
Yeah.
I think it's Scott and Bill went all over the world, and really they kind of like brought permaculture all around the world early on. Scott was one of the first people to travel with Bill and teach, and brought it to places all over the place, and taught in like really rough, teaching under like a veranda that doesn't protect you from the rain, just protects you from the sun. And these courses were 3 weeks long at the time.
Yeah.
So like people their courses had 50, 60 people, like 100. Some courses had 100 people.
Wow.
They were rocking big courses and bringing permaculture to cultures all over the place. And were fairly well received. And Scott was full of stories, but one that always stands out to me is he taught with Bill in the Ecuadorian Amazon in a course to several indigenous groups, and some Westerners were also welcome to that course. And Scott said these two warriors from a village showed up every day and sat right in the front, like full paint, like painted faces and spears, like traditional dress and everything, and sat right up front. Didn't speak a word of English. The course was being translated into Spanish. They didn't speak a word of Spanish,
Wow.
and yet they showed up every single day. And Scott was like, "What do you think that was about?" I don't know. I wasn't there. He said Bill thought it was because we had chicken for lunch every day. Everybody loves chicken. Scott was like, Bill's such a spiritual phobe that Scott thought that they really felt something, that they were like, oh, this is of a sort of kin form of wisdom to our culture. And they were like in awe of it, or sort of like in flabbergasted that they were seeing that from two white guys. And Scott was able to see that way, that like, yeah, we're doing something deeper with, like, there's an energy field that gets created almost in a PDC. And I think the students feel it. I know I felt it as a teacher and a student. And we're talking about an old form of being and knowledge, and it resonates with people all over the world. And that's really the beauty of it. Despite, the amount of criticism that can come permaculture's way, it's all over the world. It's being practiced all over the world, and people have found value in it, and that's undeniable. And so, whatever one's views are, like, permaculture's been an incredible success. It's 50-year mark, basically, right? Like, we're kind of at that
Yep.
50-year mark, and and it's a good time to take stock of what this is and what we're doing with it. I think it really is about changing our paradigms and our culture, and not in a momentary sense, but to where ecological decision making becomes our natural reaction.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're trying to achieve. I think that's what we need to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to think nowadays that permaculture is a bit of a bridge to that old sacredness sort of way that we used to all have in our indigenous traditions, and rootedness in place and stewardship of land and culture. And it's like we need a bridge because we've lost that so profoundly. So you know, we were talking. We had a small permaculture gathering just a couple days ago, and we were sort of talking about how you don't have to be sanctimonious about it, nor do you have to flagellate yourself because you're not fully ecologically there yet or something. It's a long transition, bridging a mindset, a worldview to another worldview. And it comes in spurts and stops, and it comes through practice of time spent doing this sort of thinking. And we may never even get there in our full life. Maybe that's not our path, really. The path is bringing the next generation, or
Mm.
those seeds in the gardens in St. Louis, the human seeds and the idea seeds. And we don't know how it'll all unfold, but I agree with you that permaculture has been a wild success insofar as it's everywhere on earth. There's people like you and me doing it.
We might have lost you, Jesse. Since probably the listeners can still hear me, I'll share another along these lines. Sorry to miss what Jesse's saying, but I'll share a line from Scott Pittman that really I think was one of his most profound. And this came about, him and I were sitting on a veranda in Costa Rica, and we were teaching a course in a refugee camp in the southern jungle, and it I was sort of I felt a little out of place, to be honest. Like, I'm not the sort of globetrotter who goes to the global south and puts on courses and stuff. That's at least not been how I've moved in permaculture, and it I felt a little. Jesse, I just went into a story
Good.
because
Keep going.
you cut out. All right, great. I felt a little out of place at this course in Central America, and I said to Scott, "What the hell are we doing here?" And Scott kept looking forward the entire time. We were just like sitting side by side overlooking a little garden, and he said, "We're empowering people to think in the ways that they always wanted to, but were always taught not to."
Wow.
And that hit me, and I've had to get a lot more specific on what that means. I actually have to credit Brad Lancaster, a friend of mine who is a great conversation partner. He's really challenged me to get specific. You can't just say different. You have to mean different what? Different
Mm.
how? And Scott sort of elucidated this further, but with a question that ended up being more koan like than anything. And he said, "What does paradise look like to the Inuit?"
Mm.
And when I think of the Inuit, I think of a polar landscape, and they're, seafaring and hunters and gatherers, non-agricultural people. And most of the landscape is frozen, right? Most of the year. And I think Scott really was trying to point out, what is paradise to the culture of the Inuit? It's not a food forest, right? It's not a biointensive market garden. It's not an herb spiral. It's a worldview. It's a mindset, And
Mm.
so that really hit home for me. Like, what am I doing as a permaculture teacher? It's been a bewildering journey, frankly.
Mm.
But that hit it home for me. It's about mindsets. It's about changing the way people think, and that will change how they are and what they do.
Dude. What's that quote again? Say it one more time. That's such a good quote.
What does paradise look like to the Inuit?
Oh, no, sorry, not that one. The
So
one that was like, "We're teaching people something about how they always wanted to think."
yeah, yeah, yeah. We're empowering people to think in the ways they always wanted to, but we're always taught not to.
Mm,
Yeah,
that really hits. That hits hard for me.
yeah,
And that is a great Cohen too, because I've never thought about paradise for an Inuit, but it certainly wouldn't be what I think of in the temperate climate that I'm in. So
right.
those are beautiful, Jason. I wish I wasn't having internet issues and we could keep going a little bit longer, but I think just because of the technical issues, maybe let's close it down here,
No
and then we'll
worries.
we'll have to do a part two for sure, especially as things develop with like the dry lands, like digitization and whatever else that Permaculture Institute has coming up. Please let us know, and we can connect and support each other. I think PINA and the Permaculture Institute are share similar spaces, but like in any ecosystem, we occupy slightly different niches, and we can support each other, advancing this movement and helping people take their next step along that bridge to that ecological culture that we're aiming towards. So
Mhm.
thank you, Jason, so much for being here and sharing, and really for the work that you've done for these years. I really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate your presence and your heart and everything that you've been bringing to your work, but also to this conversation. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks to all the listeners too for sticking with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And then would you send anybody to any other websites other than permaculture.org or
Um,
any
my
events
design
that you
my design
share that are
company my design company is realearthdesign.com.
okay?
I'm pretty busy, to be honest, so, if you wanna hire me, maybe that's gonna take a while.
Yeah,
I don't need to market myself, so just the projects happen, so,
that's great. Great place to be, right?
yep,
Yep,
exactly.
absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Great comments throughout. I appreciate you all. And Jason, we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Thanks so much, Jesse.
Thanks everybody. All right.